Prime Minister Modi then making that announcement that everyone was waiting for. India's lockdown now extended till the 3rd of May. Prime Minister Modi said that there was no denying the huge economic cost, but that nothing was more important than the lives of citizens. Now, he said we need to be more careful than ever before in places which are hotspots or can become new hotspots. We have to be extremely careful. In the week to come, he said there would be even more stringent restrictions. Till the 20th of April, every police station, every district, every area, the Prime Minister said, would be under scrutiny, and how it was maintaining lockdown restrictions would be analysed closely. He said those areas that pass this test, these places may see some relaxation after the 20th of April. But, he said, there were riders and conditions even to this. These relaxations could be removed at a moment's notice if it was seen that not enough care was being taken. He also said his government would in fact announced detailed guidelines on what relaxations would be possible post the 20th of April, and he didn't spell those out himself, and he said all of this was being done keeping daily workers in mind, keeping farmers in mind. The rabi crop, he said, was being harvested, and states and the centre are working together to ensure that farmers face less difficulties. He also asked all citizens to download the Arogya app, he said. He also asked for respect for corona warriors, frontline workers at this time, amid reports of doctors facing social ostracism and stigma. He also urged people not to take away jobs, to provide wages to those who need these the most at this time, and he said follow all lockdown rules until the 3rd of May. The Prime Minister talked about how citizens had saved their country even at great pain to themselves. He said he was aware of all the difficulties that were being faced, difficulties in getting food, not being able to travel, being away from family. He said citizens had done it for their country. Everyone had come together and behaved like disciplined and loyal soldiers. He also talked about how the new year was beginning in several states, even with these strict restrictions in place. But he also said India had been, in that sense, ahead of many other countries. When there were just 100 cases, that was when India made 14 days quarantine mandatory for those entering the country. When there were just 500 cases, there was a 3-week lockdown, he said. And he also talked about what had happened in other countries, and said while comparisons were odious, there was no doubt that India had dealt with this firmly and was therefore ahead of others. All right, Sanket joining us at this point, as is Nidhi Razdan. Nidhi, to you first, the highlights of that speech. Sanket or Nidhi, if you're with us, what did you make of the Prime Minister's speech? Lockdown, of course, extended till the 3rd of May now.
Ankita.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, Ankita, it's very clear that it's obviously a very difficult decision for the government and for the Prime Minister. The fact that they've had to extend this lockdown in virtually its entirety the way it is now, almost for another 3 weeks, and for the last 1 week or so or more, the Prime Minister has been taking inputs from states. He's been taking inputs from various ministries. We know that a lot of ministries like the Commerce Ministry, the Aviation Ministry, the Finance Ministry, everyone had been pushing for a plan to have some kind of a relaxation, some kind of easing of restrictions, particularly in certain industries, slowly. But it's very clear that given that we are at a very critical point in this fight against the coronavirus, this difficult decision has been taken by the Prime Minister to extend this lockdown by almost another 19-20 days. But he has left that small window open where he's talked about, the restrictions being very, very tough for the next 1 week until the 20th of April, where he has said that, hotspots everywhere, every district will be monitored, hotspots identified. If there are districts where there are no cases or fewer cases, then possibly some easing of restrictions in those areas can be considered. But by and large, the message is that, for the next almost 3 weeks or so, Ankita, this tough lockdown has to continue. As I said, a very difficult decision. NDTV's Sunil Prabhu broke the story last night when he said that late last night, the Prime Minister had essentially come to the conclusion that very little relaxation, if at all, could be given, and that's the way it has gone.
Right, Sanket, I think it's very important to stress at this point, from what we heard in the Prime Minister's speech, that the relaxation of the lockdown, when it comes, and he made sure that he made it very clear that any relaxation was only going to be considered after the 20th of April, and that too after scrutinizing every district, every police station, every area. And there appears to be this feeling that, we won't really know what those relaxations are until these guidelines are announced tomorrow, we're told. So is the jury out at this moment on, how lives and livelihoods are going to be balanced?
So, Ankita, as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, I think he did give a roadmap as to what these relaxations will be. He spoke about allowing economic activity in those zones where the virus either has been contained or there is no new case. Now, how will this be done? We have seen a bit of the work that the government has done along these lines by dividing the country or urging the states to divide their particular states and areas in three zones. One is a green zone where there is no case of coronavirus. The other is an orange zone where there are less than 15 and on the path of being contained and eventually phased out. And then the red zone where a bulk of the coronavirus cases are, which are essentially called hot spots. So he says that all these three zones are going to be monitored, and from the 20th of April onwards, and it only seems reasonable because when you impose a lockdown this huge, you also want to see what benefit the lockdown has caused. So he has said, essentially laid a roadmap that by the 20th of April, the central government is going to study and assess whether the virus has been contained in these green zones, and then eventually intra-district or intra-state activity or intra-green zone activity may be allowed, which will be economic in nature. That means movement of people, opening of shops. All of this is a subject matter of deliberation in the government. However, there is a rider to the relaxations that if there is even one case of coronavirus spreading or of violations in the lockdown or the containment efforts, then these restrictions can be put back on. So I think it is very safe to conclude at this moment that while the lockdown continues, the Prime Minister has tried to address the big concern of getting life back to normal, especially in those areas that see virtually no coronavirus cases, which is almost 400 districts of the country, or minimal number of cases. So I think it's a fair enough period to assess how we are going in this fight against coronavirus. So if the government is able to assess that cases are steadily on the decline and are not increasing, then economic activity can be allowed.
Right. Let's also bring in our guests at this point. Nikhil De, co-convener of NCPRI and social activist, is with us this morning, as is Deshratan Nigam, political analyst, and Dr. Shoranjit Chatterjee, senior consultant, internal medicine with Indraprastha Apollo Hospital. Nikhil De, to you first, do you think that the Prime Minister has in fact adequately addressed those concerns, particularly about economic activity going forward, the lives of daily wage workers, farmers? We did hear him talking about them, but as he said, the government is only going to announce detailed guidelines by tomorrow.
Yeah, so we'll have to wait for those guidelines, but along with what is currently the situation, I think for all our migrant labor, for many people who are at the edge of poverty and have now fallen back into poverty, we really need to understand in the rest of the country as well as our policymakers. We've had 3 weeks to understand that coronavirus is a very big problem and the lockdown is one of the solutions. But Poverty is another huge problem. And people staying far away from their homes, they are actually not maintaining social distance. That's something we need to understand. They are locked into little rooms with lots of people in bastis, in industrial areas, and they are not seeing the advantage either of the lockdown, and they are really, it's a ticking time bomb. Because they are sitting there, many of them at the edge now of hunger and starvation. Governments are scrambling around to try and make sure that they can get enough food. And what one should have hoped for, at least in these announcements, is that the resources that this country has, for instance, food grain stocks have been talked about for the last 3 weeks over and over again. They're huge food grain stocks. With the Prime Minister's announcement of the extension of this lockdown, essentially in the same way that it has, we should have been able to give some sense of confidence to those people. Huge numbers of people who are facing not just poverty, they are literally facing hunger and starvation. And we need to think about them. We cannot say, look at it at the same standard as the middle class does. All of us are in our homes with enough food, with enough space to maintain social distance between each other. What is the reality of that huge number of people, roughly 40-50% of the population? Even those who walked back, after that there are huge numbers who are left behind. Even governments are spending so much of their time trying to deal with feeding people who are far away. You can't do it just with cooked food. We have seen situations in Surat, in Delhi, in other places. We need to understand that, and hopefully when tomorrow with the guidelines, we will be able to think about those people. Right. Somewhere even before the first lockdown, we should have thought about people at least being able to reach home, which is some form of social security or security for themselves. We now also need to think about those people who are far away from home, who have no work to go to, who have no income, who have finished the little bit of money that they had with them, and who are not able to maintain social distance. Their lives are such, their rooms are such, their places where they go to the toilet is such, their places where they get water is such, their places when people come, when the administration comes to give them food through food packets is such, they crowd around that. It's very, very difficult. So it's a different life, a different lockdown life for them. And it is something we need to understand. It's equivalent. What people are facing through the virus across the country is one thing. What people are facing through poverty because of the lockdown is another, which we need to understand. And I am disappointed to that extent that we do not give it equal. The Prime Minister saying we need to think about them is one thing. We've been thinking about it. And we cannot leave it just to the private sector. And the resources that the country has in food grain, in Narega money, these are things that need to be reached to these people particularly. And it's there. It's not that I agree we are a poor country. The Prime Minister himself said that we have resource constraints, but we cannot put people's backs to the wall. What will they do?
Nidhi, I think the bigger concern here seems to be, and this is something we've been sort of discussing steadily, the fact that India perhaps because of its built-in inequalities cannot afford to do social distancing in the way, say, the Western world can. We've seen 3 weeks of this already bring untold hardships to people. We're looking at a period of at least 3 weeks more. How feasible is this going to be?
I think that is the biggest question, and what Nikhil Dey was saying there is that it is India's poorest, most marginalized people who are huge in numbers, who are being affected by this lockdown the most. It's easy for us. We are in our homes, we are with our families, many of us, we have jobs, at least for now. But, these are people who are living on daily wages and don't know where their next meal is coming from. And as Nikhil Dey was also pointing out, as we reported as well consistently over the last few weeks, even though these migrant labor camps, for instance, have been set up, the ground reality is so different. They're not getting food. They're not getting ration. Their ration cards are, back in their homes. So there needs to be a system, these guidelines, whatever they are announced tomorrow, there needs to be something that's very clearly set out for the poorest of the poor. I think a lot of people were hoping that the Prime Minister would make maybe some announcements for more money to be given by the centre to help the poor. But we heard the Food Minister, Mr. Paswan, telling NDTV just yesterday that states can invoke the Disaster Relief Act and allocate more food to people. Our food godowns, we know, are overflowing with grain. So it's a huge irony, a cruel irony at this point that is what is happening. But yes, if you compare to other countries, Ankita, just last night, President Macron in France announced a 1-month extension of a very strict lockdown in France, and has announced that there'll be no public gatherings allowed till the middle of July. I think a lot of experts say that while a lockdown was absolutely necessary in the way that it was done 3 weeks ago in India, I think the call was perhaps for a slightly more calibrated approach. And the Prime Minister has left that window open by saying that after the 20th of April, those districts that do see fewer or no cases, certain easing of restrictions can be considered there. So it really all depends on how these cases pan out, the number of deaths pan out. But India is not France. I think that was the point I was trying to make. India is not France. India is not the UK. We do have a unique set of challenges here, a unique set of problems. The economy here was already under severe distress before the coronavirus hit. There is a concern that economic distress, may kill more people than the coronavirus itself as far as India is concerned. So I think that the Prime Minister, the government are acutely aware of that. It's not an easy decision to make, and perhaps those districts in those states that do see progress and that do see fewer cases, perhaps some easing will take place after the 20th of April. We'll have to wait and see. But by and large, it looks like a strict lockdown in force, at least for the next 19-20 days. And thereafter, we just have to wait and see where we are. We were talking to Dr. Randeep Guleria, the director of AIIMS, last night, and we asked him about the spike in cases that we are seeing. And his assessment was that the lockdown was necessary. We would have had a far larger number of cases if we had not locked down in the way that we did, and that we should expect a spike in cases in the next few days, but it will also plateau and start coming down. We are also testing more. Remember that it may not be enough, but we are testing more than we were, say, a couple of weeks ago. We should begin to see a plateau, according to Dr. Guleria, and perhaps we can turn a corner in about another week or so. That's why the next 1 week is particularly important. So fingers crossed that does happen.
Right. Sunil Prabhu is also with us. Sunil, confirmation then of the story you broke last night that there is going to be no immediate easing of restrictions. If anything, restrictions in the next week are going to be perhaps even more stringent than what we've seen in the last 3 weeks or so. And there's also going to be a detailed scrutiny of areas, of police station areas, of entire districts. And it's only going to be after that that there is going to be any easing, if at all. And even those, the Prime Minister indicated there would be riders and conditions attached to any kind of easing of restrictions. If it was felt that COVID cases were on the rise again, then those the lifting of restrictions could again be rescinded. So what are we looking at going ahead? He talked about guidelines to be announced. There has been some indication of what some of those could be. Give us a sense, farmers clearly in focus and daily workers too.
Thanks, Ankita, because it was quite tense, and thanks to NDTV for going ahead with that story, because when we said that there will be no relaxation in the lockdown, we said also that they will continue to monitor the situation and make an assessment because the situation is critical and the demands and recommendations of various ministries will be considered at a later stage. It's in that backdrop that the Prime Minister himself, as you rightly pointed out, even indicating what we said last night, that the guidelines will be issued. It's not going. We were expecting it to coincide with this telecast. He says it will be done tomorrow. So those guidelines to be issued and standard operating procedures to be issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs is expected, and they'll be working on that in the next few hours, and hopefully we'll get it as soon as it's ready for release. Having said that, you're right. The Prime Minister wanting to connect with the masses, in particular the migrant labor, the poor, the downtrodden and the farmers, because he understands after 21 days it's extremely critical, and it's now more than a national health emergency. It's also the question of how you are going to calibrate this entire process. And if you see from the way he spoke, he was very categorical that there has to be some way forward for these people. And as you rightly pointed out, the next 7 days, that's a week till the 20th, they will really be extremely careful in how they are going to go ahead and monitor that situation, because each district whether it is in the red, orange or green. They will have to make that assessment. It will have to be contained because we can't afford, as Nidhi was pointing out, India has its own unique set of problems. It's going to be extremely difficult to assess the situation and allow that containment zone not to be porous. So it's in that backdrop that those assessments will be made, those recommendations from various ministries will be considered to open up, to allow livelihoods to take place. Having said that, one last point that I would like to add is that it's critical for the Ministry of Home Affairs to continue to monitor the situation. The Prime Minister himself saying and making that distinction from, burning agarbattis to diyas to, clapping hands and vessels. This time saying, reach out to the poor, look after your elderly. Good set of 7 points that were made. Of course, there's been some criticism from people like Mr. Abhishek Singhvi and others who have tweeted on this. But nevertheless, the fact is that the Prime Minister is now trying to make a subtle difference and understand that people's lives and livelihoods are as important and is something that the government will take note of.
Right. Let's also bring in Dr. Suranjit Chatterjee for the medical perspective on all this. Dr. Chatterjee, we heard the Prime Minister talk about how when there were just 100 cases, India made 14 days quarantine mandatory for anyone entering the country. When there were just 500 cases, the 3-week lockdown was announced, and that it's at this point it's critical to not let our guard down, and that if anything, the next week has to be even more, that we need to see even more stringent following of rules. From a medical perspective, would you say that India has actually sort of ticked the boxes, as it were, and in that sense we're better off than a lot of Western countries which had easier norms, which didn't have the kind of strict lockdown that we've seen, and who are now seeing a very high spike in deaths?
From a medical perspective, I'm very happy that the lockdown has been extended. If we would not have extended it to the strictness that the Honorable Prime Minister has said, the entire effort of these last 3 weeks would have gone down the drain. It is now the time when we should reap the benefits out of that. As has been mentioned, that these hotspots have to be found. We have to be really strict. The social distancing and everything has to be maintained. Whatever the healthcare facilities have been ramped up and the investigation facilities that have been ramped up, they have to be all utilized to the helm. And I hope that these almost 17, 18 days of extension is really going to help us fight this entire pandemic. I would have been very disappointed if this extension would not have been announced today. Obviously, we need to look into the economic aspects of it. I think there is the things that would come tomorrow, or the guidelines that would come tomorrow, would look into the economic things, because that is also very important. Just health is definitely important, but economic things also have to be looked into very strictly.
Deshadan Nigam, a quick word from you. We heard the Prime Minister refer to how states and the centre were working together, especially to ensure that farmers face fewer difficulties, and so do migrant workers. At this point, though, the states have repeatedly asked for greater financial assistance. We didn't hear the Prime Minister talk about that. Perhaps there's going to be some indication of that tomorrow?
See, let us be very clear. I am getting an echo. See, the best that the law is ended, and the issue is to look after the economy. The Prime Minister was very careful in telling the world.
Nigam, we're having some trouble with our audio to you. We'll try and correct that and come back in a moment. But Sanket, the same question to you at this point. We've heard the states repeatedly ask the centre now for financial assistance, for bailouts. I believe we don't have in Sanket either. Let's go across now to the various states. Alok Pandey joining us at this point. Alok, we talked yesterday about the steps that Uttar Pradesh was considering now to try and facilitate the movement of harvested crops to mandis. But at least until the 20th of April, it seems there's going to be very little easing of restrictions. Are you getting a sense of how things are going to work exactly?
See, because this is a BJP-ruled state, so the actions and the words of the Chief Minister have been in sync with what the Prime Minister has been saying. So before the Prime Minister spoke, we hadn't heard too much specifics about how exactly UP would proceed with this extended lockdown. We all knew, of course, I mean, it wasn't said, but we all knew that the lockdown was going to be extended in some form or the other. But I think it is also interesting to note from this state's perspective, and this is India's most populous state, that Mr. Adityanath and his team of officers had already announced a slew of measures for agriculture, irrespective of how the lockdown was going to be extended. For instance, what they had already decided was that they were going to open up 5,000 procurement centers across 75 districts for the procurement of grain. Now, the hitch obviously would be how to get the farmer to take his grain or her grain from the field or from his home to that mandi or that procurement center. One thing that we have found in our travels to villages close to Lucknow is that farmers have found it difficult to find transport to actually take their perishable produce in one case, because the harvest is still ongoing. The last time we visited, it had just about started. To take his or her perishable produce from the field to the closest mandi where he or she can get a decent price for it. So that's been an issue, you know. While, yes, the government has allowed farmers to be out on the fields, they have allowed the harvest, they've also allowed the movement of these combined harvester machines that can harvest in a quicker time. All of those relaxations have been given, and some of them are actually visible on the ground. But I think given that a stricter lockdown has been enforced for the next week also, it will be interesting to see whether or not these grain procurement centers that are going to open up from tomorrow, whether they have any inflow or not. Because if the farmer does not find any transport to get from the village to the mandi, then there will be a problem. So how the state deals with it, of course, is another question, and I think they will give us more clarity also. They've already said that they're going to exempt all vehicles which are carrying produce or which have to do with agriculture to go from the villages to these mandis. The other thing that they have announced, just to take a little bit more of your time, is that they have said that you see, in a state like UP, it's not only the government that procures its grain, it is also private player, middlemen, they also procure the grain. So the government has said that, look, if somebody wants to go to the village and procure from the doorstep also, even that is allowed. But it has to be at the MSP, at the minimum support price that is announced by the government. Now, of course, this measure on paper looks very good. Whether this will actually happen on the ground, whether MSP rules will be adhered to, and whether the farmer will actually manage to benefit in a year as critical as this. This is not a normal year. We've had so much of a lockdown, and the rural economy, of course, is suffering. So whether the farmer can get that benefit, that's the big question, and that's something that we need to watch out for, not only in the next week, but till the whole time this whole procurement exercise takes place.
Saurabh Gupta is also with us from Mumbai. Saurabh, specifically because Maharashtra has seen the highest number of cases, and indeed Mumbai has seen so many hotspots, we heard the Prime Minister reference the fact that places which are hotspots or can potentially become new hotspots, there's going to be a lot of focus on them, and there we have to be extremely careful, and there seems to be no likelihood of any kind of relaxation of restrictions in such places. So for the near term, it's likely that both Mumbai and indeed large parts of Maharashtra could be under total lockdown.
Well, actually, Mumbai and Pune, and that is something that the authorities here too have given us a hint of, and said that, I have an echo. So obviously, this is something that authorities say that they will look into very clearly. Now, Mumbai and Pune are international gateways. They have people coming in from other places. So if you open up Mumbai and Pune, and if you open up international airport, and if you open up international travel, then of course there is going to be a problem for Mumbai and Pune. This is exactly what the Chief Minister also encapsulated when he addressed the state, saying that, the reason why Mumbai has so many cases is the fact that we were receiving international travelers from very early on, and as a result of which now we have so many cases, but also pointing out that a lot of these cases are asymptomatic, one, and B, that they're coming from people who have been isolated or quarantined. So it's extremely important from a Mumbai or a Pune point of view to have this lockdown continue, but at the same time, ensure that essentials are available, essentials are delivered to people, and in some cases in containment stores, it has to be in containment zones, I beg your pardon, it has to be door-to-door delivery. Now, there are several measures that have been taken. For example, some banks have started mobile ATMs, so that if you're in a containment zone, the ATM comes inside your premises. You don't have to step out to access your money. So these are the kind of things that are being done. But Mumbai and Pune will definitely need a lockdown, given the fact that they have not only the highest number of cases, but also our hubs. And also for Mumbai specifically, it's a very densely populated city. It's an overcrowded city. And in this situation, you need to actually ensure that there is no, sort of further spread of the disease. At this point, authorities say it's under control because what they say is the ratio of number of patients to number of tests is at about 4.5%, which is an acceptable ratio, but they want to bring that down, which is why they need the lockdown and the containment zones. But also at the same time, they say that given the fact that there are so many asymptomatic patients, 65% of those who test positive are asymptomatic according to government data. And also the fact that, most of these patients who are now testing positive are coming from those who've been quarantined or isolated or are in containment zones.
Right.
The fact is, to limit the spread, you need these measures to be.
All right. Thanks for that, Saurabh. Nidhi, if I can come back to you, the 7 appeals we heard from the Prime Minister today. He talked about taking care of the elderly, to continue to maintain social distancing, take steps to boost immunity, download the Arogya Setu app. And that's something that's been quite controversial, with many raising questions about the privacy aspect of that. He also talked about helping those in need and not laying off employees and respecting and honoring COVID workers. Now, there are those who have already, all right, I believe we can go across to Nikhil Day on this. Nikhil Day, would you say that, just appeals to employers to continue to pay wages and not lay off employees, is that by itself enough? Or, do we need to see far more safety nets being put in place officially?
Absolutely. So we can't simply, what we have had in both these lockdowns are orders from the Ministry of Home Affairs, orders from the Prime Minister saying do this, follow this, and then appeals to civil society and to the industry without the government itself doing what it can. Now, we understand we are a poor country, but there are some things that are beyond my understanding, beyond our understanding. Why are we not using the food grains that we have? Today, it is absolutely clear that those people who are there, you can say seven things. One of the things is help the poor and needy. But why is the government not going out to put that safety net in place? Why did the Prime Minister not say our 77 million tons of food grain stocks will be used? It's more than double the buffer that's needed. We will use it and reach it to everyone. Then ask civil society and others to give the other parts, because a hungry person is not going to listen. The second thing is that when the Prime Minister, all the various things we are talking about, the Arogya app, these are all far beyond, apart from the privacy questions, they are far beyond the world of these people who are workers, they are people with dignity, and they are now lost in some other zone. When you are telling private employers, please pay, why is the government not paying, for instance, NREGA workers? NREGA workers can't go to work. The government has passed some strange guidelines saying stay at home, but yet NREGA will remain open. How can it remain open? No district administration or government can run it. And yet government should be giving their wages at home, like the Ministry of Labour has ordered all private employers to give wages at home. Government should be giving wages at home. That will give some sense of security to these 10 crore people who are from a livelihood security program, and there's a budget for that. So it's beyond our understanding that the things that are available with government, why aren't they being prioritized and being used at this time? And making people feel more and more restless, more and more insecure. Whatever little they had with them, 1,000, 2,000 rupees they've spent, we know people, and they're desperate to get home. So even the first time there should have been some thought, and if after 7 days there's some easing of restriction, we do need to think just as the way we thought about the people who were abroad getting home. We need to think about these people. If we can't have them get work and employment and money and some sense of security where there is, and social distancing where there is, at least let them have their homes. So why can't we think of a way of reaching them safely, of putting quarantine near their villages?
Well, we can only hope that there will be some guidelines about that being announced tomorrow.
Right.
Do hold that thought. Do hold that thought,
so,
Nikhil Day. I do have to take a break. I'll be back in just a moment on top of the hour with the latest on the Prime Minister's speech extending India's total lockdown until, the lockdown till the 3rd of May, and there could be some easing of restrictions post the 20th of April. We'll continue to get all the latest on that very big story. We'll be back right after this break. The big breaking story, Prime Minister Modi extending the current nationwide lockdown to control the spread of coronavirus till the 3rd of May. He said any decision on easing restrictions in parts of the country would be taken after the 20th of April, keeping in mind the difficulties that are being faced by India's poorest. He said till the 20th of April, every police station, every district, every state would be monitored closely to see whether the lockdown is being followed, and it'll be only after that that we decide on relaxing restrictions. He said India had to ensure that the virus did not spread and that every citizen should be worried every time they hear that someone somewhere in India has died of the virus, and ensure that new hotspots just do not spring up. He also put out a 7-point charter for people to follow, which includes social distancing, taking care of the elderly, the poor, protecting jobs, and preventing attacks on doctors and other frontline COVID-19 workers. Let's listen to the highlights of that speech.
साथियों, सारे सुझावों को ध्यान में रखते हुए ये तय किया गया है कि भारत में लॉकडाउन को अब 3 मई तक और बढ़ाना पड़ेगा। यानी 3 मई तक हम सभी को, हर देशवासी को लॉकडाउन में ही रहना होगा। अगले 1 सप्ताह में कोरोना के खिलाफ लड़ाई में कठोरता और ज्यादा बढ़ाई जाएगी। 20 अप्रैल तक हर कस्बे, हर थाने, हर जिले, हर राज्य को बड़ी बारीकी से परखा जाएगा। वहां लॉकडाउन का कितना पालन हो रहा है, उस क्षेत्र ने कोरोना से खुद को कितना बचाया है, इसका मूल्यांकन लगातार किया जाएगा। जो क्षेत्र इस अग्नि परीक्षा में सफल होंगे, जो अपने यहां हॉटस्पॉट नहीं बढ़ने देंगे और जिनके हॉटस्पॉट में बदलने की आशंका भी कम होगी, वहां पर 20 अप्रैल से कुछ जरूरी गतिविधियों की अनुमति, छूटछाट दी जा सकती है। लेकिन याद रखिए, ये अनुमति सशर्त होगी। बाहर निकलने के नियम बहुत सख्त होंगे।
Nidhi Razdan joining us. Sanket Upadhyay is with us. Arvind Gunasekar too. Nidhi, to you first. The highlight of that speech, the fact that the lockdown is now extended till the 3rd of May. It seems the calculation there is that there is a holiday there for May Day and then it's a weekend, and that's why 3rd May has been determined rather than the end of the month. But to all extents and purposes, all restrictions continuing for the moment, and a review only after the 20th of April?
That's right, Ankita. As NDTV Sunil Prabhu broke last night at 9 o'clock, it is essentially a continuation of the current lockdown that we are seeing, but with a small window that has been left open by the Prime Minister, that after the 20th of April, those areas which see fewer cases or no cases at all, there can be a consideration to ease some restrictions in those areas and allow some kind of economic activity to resume there. But every district, every police station area, every place is going to be monitored very, very strictly, he said, particularly in this coming week, and thereafter these possible relaxations can take place. But by and large, till the 3rd of May, it is going to be as we have seen it for the last 21 days. And in effect, it means, Ankita, another 19-20 days of restrictions to continue. Government officials citing, May Day, 1st May, and the weekend, 3rd May is a Sunday, for why it was extended to the 3rd and not was not ended on the 30th of April itself, which would have effectively amounted to 2 weeks. But it is a very difficult balancing act and a difficult decision for the government because we have seen countries around the world effectively use, most of them at least, use these strict lockdowns as a measure to get more testing, tracing and their hospitals up and running in place. I think one of the big questions will be for Indian officials will be that, are we going to see an exponentially major increase in testing? They have suggested that will happen. Many experts feel that we're still not doing enough testing, that we need to do it on a much, much bigger scale. So if we do see much more expanded testing and we use this period to do that, I think doctors, will particularly push for that. But I think the concerns on the economy are very real. There was already economic distress before the lockdown was announced. Industry has been asking for more money to be spent on rescue packages. Small and medium industries have been saying they don't have money to pay salaries for this coming month and desperately need help. And of course, we've been repeatedly talking about the people who are affected the most by this lockdown, for whom this is a life or death situation now, quite literally, and that is for India's poor, for India's migrants. So we have to wait and see if the government is going to announce any, special incentives, any special packages for them, a better way to actually get food into their hands, because at the moment that seems to be the biggest problem. Despite migrants being in designated migrant camps in many states, they're not getting food, they're not getting the ration that they're supposed to get. Our godowns are overflowing with food grain, but that's not actually reaching people who need it most on the ground, which is a very, very cruel irony. So for these people whom we've been talking to for weeks now, they're saying hunger will kill us before the virus does. So I think most of the attention needs to be focused on India's poor and one hopes that when these guidelines on the lockdown are announced tomorrow, will there be any other package as well? Will there be any other announcement on how India's poor will be taken care of? That will be important. But also I think industry will be looking to see if there are any announcements for them as well.
Yes, indeed. Sanket, I think, the overarching theme of what we heard from the Prime Minister today, at least he did say, yes, guidelines would be announced by the government tomorrow. But it was more about what citizens can do rather than what the government is doing. He made that 7-point appeal, talking about paying wages to workers, making sure there's no unemployment, retaining staff as much as possible. He also talked about how citizens had come together and been loyal and disciplined soldiers. So is the message then, ask not what this government can do for you, but what you can do for the government? All right, I believe we don't have the line with Sanket right now. Arvind also joining us at this point with more data, we're told. Arvind, take us through what you have first.
Ankita, the number of COVID cases in the country has breached a 5-digit mark. As on date, the number of COVID cases that have been reported across the country is at around 10,363 cases. The biggest concern for the officials who are actually handling this this pandemic, is that the rate at which the cases increasing in the last 2 to 3 days. That is the rate of around 1,000 cases, over around 1,000 cases have been reported across the country in the last 2 to 3 days, adding also along with the steady increase with the deaths. In fact, as on date, around 339 people have been succumbed to this particular infection. So this is the biggest concern according to the officials, and they are coming up with containment plan to somehow break this transmission. When we spoke to some of the officials, what they are saying is that in order to make the lockdown effective, we have to segregate the infected ones from the non-infected ones. Only if we segregate the infected ones with the non-infected ones, this particular lockdown will become effective. In order to segregate the infected ones from the non-infected ones, we have to first identify the infected ones. For that, we have to test more. But that particular thing is actually making things more difficult for the ICMR and also for the Health Ministry officials, because the procurement of the kits is not going as per our plan. In fact, earlier the ICMR had come up with an advisory, had come up with an recommendation asking for the use of antibody test kits in hotspot areas, in cluster areas, in order to do a rapid testing and also to find and also to identify the positive cases. But because we are not getting enough antibody kits that were actually the order was placed with the Chinese firm, things have actually gone out of plan, and now again ICMR is again looking for agencies, looking for companies outside China for procurement of antibody kits. As on date, ICMR has raised a purchase order for over 50 lakh antibody kits, but as on date we have not even got a single antibody kits. In fact, the first purchase order was raised on March 28th. Since March 28th, when we spoke to the ICMR officials, they told us that the first batch of 2.5 lakh antibody kits will be arriving on April 9th itself. But as on date, that particular shipment has not yet arrived in India, and what we are hearing is that because China has changed its policy, they have strengthened their policy because of bad quality, because of complaints of bad quality kits. China's policy has changed, and that's why the shipment has not yet arrived in India. So now ICMR is going for other countries like Switzerland and also South Korea and also Singapore for procurement of antibody kits. So only if we get the antibody kits, we can use it for a random testing, for a rapid testing, and we can identify the infected ones. And only if we could identify them, we can actually segregate them, and then only we can break the chain of transmission. This is according to the ICMR official. Yesterday they also came up with a sample pool testing method also. Even that would be implemented in the coming weeks. But as on date, ICMR officials and also Health Ministry officials are eagerly waiting for the procurement of testing kits so that can be used to segregate the affected with the infected ones and the non-infected ones.
All right, those are indeed big concerns going ahead, and that would partly perhaps explain the Prime Minister's repeated reiterations that the next week or so has to be perhaps even more stringent in terms of restrictions, and all precautions that have been followed so far must be doubly followed right now. But of course, the larger questions remain, and we'll be going into all of those in greater detail right now. Let me quickly go across to Amitabh Dubey, who's with us at this point. Amitabh Dubey, would you say that the Prime Minister addressed all the concerns that have been flagged, not just by the states, but by opposition parties, but by experts who are sort of looking at the particular condition that daily wage workers and migrants have been facing in these existing 3 weeks of the lockdown? Would you say that beyond sort of saying that, yes, there are going to be announcements which will follow, did we hear enough?
No, I think I was a bit disappointed because one of the big issues right now, I think what the Prime Minister hasn't acknowledged enough, in my opinion, is that the economy has literally fallen off a cliff because of the lockdown. We have an estimate of 7,000 to 8,000 crores of losses to industry, which is 3% of GDP, which is a huge amount. Unemployment, there is the CMI estimates that job losses are 12 crores, which is 4 times what the unemployment rate was that we got so surprised by in the 45-year high unemployment rate. And there was a statistic that the drop in electricity consumption in India has been 18% since December. And this is 3 times what it's been in EU and the United States. These are very serious economic numbers that tell us we have a very major problem. And I feel that we have to wait and see what the government announces in the next 24 hours. But the speech did not really acknowledge this or suggest any concrete measures to deal with it. So in this sense, the migrant workers, the daily wagers still have a lot of problems. And I think we need more concrete steps. And we can discuss what those steps might be to address this rather than offer very general reassurances.
Right. I'll try and go across to Vivek Reddy of the BJP, also joining us at this point. I believe he's going to be with us in a moment. But a quick follow-up question. The fact that we heard the Prime Minister really spell out more what citizens can do at this point. He talked about how India's come together and how citizens have been like loyal and disciplined soldiers, and he asked for more support going ahead. That 7-point appeal that we heard from him, where he talks about, making sure people retain jobs, not to sack people at this point, to ensure wages. Would you say that, at some level we're also seeing the Prime Minister appeal to citizens, to individuals at this point, without perhaps spelling out enough steps of what the government is going to be doing in order to also have safety nets in place?
Yeah, so we know that the Prime Minister is a good communicator and he communicates effectively to the people. And he's made it very clear repeatedly, even before this crisis, that citizens have duties and we have to expect them to follow those duties. And certainly we've seen citizens, of course there are exceptions, but by and large citizens have stood up and cooperated with whatever directions they've got from the central government, state government, and they're all cooperating with this very severe but perhaps necessary lockdown. But citizens also have rights. And it is here that I think the government is not emphasizing enough. What is the government doing so our daily wagers, our laborers, our farmers can exercise their right to life, their right to livelihood, even within the constraints of this very severe lockdown.
Right.
And, so I think there are different ways that this can be dealt with. There is the idea of the smart lockdown, which perhaps we'll see after the 20th, because the Prime Minister has promised that he will begin to ease things on a case-by-case basis. So we want to see what happens there.
Right.
But broadly, I think citizens have duties, but they also have rights, and the government has to deliver those rights to them.
All right, delivering rights to citizens. Vivek Reddy, extending the lockdown was inevitable. I think, everyone will agree. But did we need to hear the Prime Minister actually spell out a more concrete plan of action to isolate hotspots? He did refer to them. He talked about existing hotspots as well as potential hotspots. But what is going to be done to isolate these hotspots while also creating perhaps some space for movement of goods for some industries to restart?
Well, I think, first of all, the Prime Minister has indicated very clearly the roadmap that is to be taken by the nation in addressing this pandemic. It is a big challenge, and this challenge has been addressed one of the best by amongst all other nations in the world. That is what the Prime Minister, that is a message that was given by the Prime Minister. And the most important of it was that the people of India, the citizens of India, are the ones who have now taken control of their destiny in fighting this pandemic. The Prime Minister has marshaled all the energies of the nation to ensure that there is complete compliance to face this challenge, once-in-a-generation challenge that has struck India and the world. So this is where the Prime Minister has really communicated to the people. He has ensured that the entire energies of the nation is marshaled to fight this pandemic. And that is where we have to give credit to the Prime Minister, because he has that following and he has that base where people will respond to him. This is number one. Second is, as Amitabh said, I don't think the Prime Minister is discounting any other measures to tackle this pandemic, the side effects of this pandemic. For example, Prime Minister has indicated that the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana will have certain additional benefits that is to be given. This is what he has indicated very clearly. Those people who have been left out of the social security nets will be covered. And if you look at the wholesome proposals brought by the Prime Minister, I think the first priority today is that we must fight this pandemic off. And there are smart ways also, which the Prime Minister has not ruled out. He said that he will enforce these smart ways post the 20th to ensure that the hotspots are covered and the hotspots are prioritized and the connectivity is removed from these hotspots to ensure that there's reduction here. What is to be appreciated today is that amongst all the nations of the world, where this pandemic has taken huge fatalities to the extent of lakhs of people being affected and thousands of people dying.
Yes.
I think it is far better contained in India because of advanced measures that we have taken.
Right.
So what we see is a further chapter of these advanced measures, which are absolutely essential to ensure that India is brought out of the pandemic.
Amitabh Dubey, is that an assessment you'd agree with? Because yes, certainly we saw, and as the Prime Minister also brought our notice to the fact that India, when it only had 100 cases, made mandatory quarantine for anyone entering the country, 14 days in quarantine. Then when we had 500 cases, the 3-week lockdown was announced. So in that sense, has India been ahead of the curve, as it were, when you compare us to other nations, first world nations even, which are now struggling to cope?
Well, firstly, we should hold the triumphalism. I hope my friend Vivek Reddy is correct and the Prime Minister is correct that we've dealt with it. But we are now reaching the level where the cases are accelerating. So we should hope that the curve flattens. We should hold our judgments to when we've actually seen this through rather than start comparing ourselves with this or that country. I think there is a case to be made that we were, in many ways, we were slow. But I don't want to get into the details of start criticizing everything the government does at this point of time. So I think we should hold our opinion for whether we have been ahead of the rest of the world or behind in a few weeks when we've seen the whole picture. And hopefully the Prime Minister will be right in that statement. But I think the point is that we are actually in an economic crisis right now. And all the numbers I mentioned, 7-8 lakh crores of losses to businesses, 12 crore job losses, these are currently temporary things. But if we don't have a proper economic package, they will become perhaps not permanent, but much more longer and more entrenched in the economy, and we'll have a very severe economic problem. So I would hope that in the next 24 to 48 hours, the Prime Minister comes up with a very strong economic package, because so far we've had a good first step, but certainly compared with what other countries are doing, we have a lot longer way to go in the economic sense.
Vivek Reddy, there are those who would say that the Prime Minister again seems to have shifted the onus of fighting corona onto the states, including right down to the district administration, whether it comes to testing or whether it's sort of implementing all social distancing norms. Does the centre now really need to demarcate what financial resources it's going to be providing, how there's going to be better coordination with states?
Well, I think at the district level, in the various circulars issued by the central government, they have made available funds from the National Disaster Response Relief Management Fund. Relief Fund and Management Fund. These are two different funds. I think this has been made available directly to the district administration by the centre. This is number one. The second is the state. What the Prime Minister has called for is a uniform integrated approach between all the states, so that there could be a common framework or a common standard to this challenge. I think that is very clearly laid out, and all the states have indicated that they will follow the directions issued by the Prime Minister based on the expert information that he is getting and the decisions that he is taking. Now, one thing that is unique is that though the states have their own powers, whether it is healthcare or whether it is agriculture or whether it is any other affected area, though the states have their own powers, all of them are standardizing their response to what the centre is doing. And this is a very good thing, unlike in USA, where each state has had different responses and the situation has become chaotic. So this is one thing that we really need to impress upon. And the Prime Minister has also indicated that the burden is equal upon the citizens of our country and the people of our country. We have to take this burden. We have to make this sacrifice. We ensure that we bring all the energy in order to ensure that this challenge is met with. The other aspect is, which we have to look into, Amitabh is insisting on the economic effects. Well, initial packages have been given. Initial packages have clearly indicated that there is a 3-month postponement of the EOI, the IBC procedures, the NPR categorizations are all stalled. And many other things, the burdensome aspects of this lockdown have been dealt with by the government in the first package. If there are further cascading effects on the economy, the government will certainly take care of those issues and ensure that wherever succor has to be provided, wherever strength has to be provided, it will be provided. So therefore, it is an all-round.
Are we going to see some sort of movement being allowed of migrant workers who have been sort of stopped in their tracks as they tried to make their way to their homes sometimes in states very far away? It's not an ideal situation to have many of them locked up together in these relief camps that they are currently in. Is that something that's going to be facilitated post the 20th of April?
I think that will be a decision which the government will be closely looking upon. It depends. Such a decision depends upon the fact that today the rural areas are free from this contamination, free from this plague. So we would not want a situation where this is transported into the rural areas and dispersed vast across the small country. It will be very dangerous for this country to have such an eventuality. So therefore, it is a balance of probabilities. It is a balance of various priorities, a decision which the government will have to take based on expert opinion. But I think the government will be closely looking at these choices to be made, and it will be a holistic approach to ensure that in public use, the health of the people of this nation is protected.
All right, we'll take a very quick break at this point and come back with lots more, including the latest from the Prime Minister's speech. And we'll follow this up with going across to our reporters in various states. The focus quite clearly is going to be on the states now. Presumably, we'll hear from more chief ministers in the hours and days ahead, talking about exactly how lockdown stage 2 is going to operate on the ground. We'll be back in just a moment. So Prime Minister Modi extending the current lockdown to control the spread of COVID-19 till the 3rd of May. He's also said any decision on easing restrictions in parts of the country will be taken only after the 20th of April, that too keeping in mind the difficulties that are being faced by India's poorest. In just the last few minutes, the Prime Minister has changed his display photograph in his Twitter account, and that is from the moment he began his speech this morning, and he has a scarf which he's using as a homemade mask, as it were. He was wearing it when he first came on. He removed it then to address the nation. But this photograph clearly an indication of wanting every Indian citizen to cover their faces as if at all they step out in these lockdown times. But the Prime Minister also talked about needing to ensure that the virus does not spread to any further parts of the country. He said we should be worried every time we hear about somebody dying. We must also ensure that new potential hotspots do not spring up. He also put out a 7-point charter for people to follow that includes social distancing, taking care of the elderly and the poor, protecting jobs and preventing attacks on doctors and other frontline COVID-19 workers when there have been worrying reports of ostracization and stigmatization of frontline COVID workers. Let me go right across to those who are joining us at this point. Raghav Chadha, MLA of the Aam Aadmi Party, is with us as we speak. Ankur Bhatia, Executive Director of the Bird Group, is with us. Amitabh Dubey continues to be with us as well. Raghav Chadha, are we now really going to hear Chief Ministers of States also outlining what's going to be done on the ground in lockdown 2.0, as we're calling it, stage 2 of this lockdown? We were expecting to hear from the Delhi Chief Minister yesterday. That didn't happen. Are we going to see some statements from him shortly also?
Well, yes, I think the Chief Minister of Delhi, as he conducts his regular press conference in the evening and gives a complete health bulletin for the NCT of Delhi, as well as the measures that he and his government are taking, I'm pretty sure that in the coming few hours, he will certainly address another press conference and point out or highlight the measures that his government will be taking in lockdown 2.0. And he was one of the chief ministers who actually suggested to the Honorable Prime Minister in the VC that the Prime Minister had with all chief ministers that the extension of a lockdown is necessary, especially in a city like Delhi. And I think the Prime Minister has taken into account the concerns as well as the suggestions made by various chief ministers. We have the benefit of learning from the best practices that have been followed across the globe as far as tackling COVID-19 is concerned, as well as lessons of failures from various countries. And I think one of the reasons why an outbreak of COVID-19 has impacted some countries pretty adversely is because the restrictions or the lockdown came in at a later point in time, because the community transmission phase in those countries had already begun by then. I think India has been proactive in that sense, and we have imposed the lockdown restrictions much before the community transmission phase had hit us. And I think lockdown is extremely essential to contain the damage of COVID-19. However, I think what I would have loved the Prime Minister to say, and I'm pretty sure that the guidelines that his government will issue will certainly throw some light on the following, which is how will the poor, the downtrodden, those who are at the bottom of the pyramid survive? What will be the financial sort of help that will be offered to them? Is there a thought out plan for making arrangements of food, their livelihood, so on and so forth? I think we in Delhi have come out with a comprehensive plan vis-a-vis providing daily meals, dry ration, as well as financial aid to e-rickshaw drivers, to auto drivers, to laborers, to migrant workers, so on and so forth. But it would be wonderful if the government of India also throws some light on that as to how do they wish to address this extremely essential concern. But he did certainly mention in his remarks that the poor, the poorest of the poor, is what he'll certainly be looking at, and how do they survive lockdown 2.0.
And Raghav Chadha, what kind of financial assistance would the Delhi government, for instance, be hoping for? Are you hoping that there will be some kind of concrete announcement of that as well?
So the finance minister of the government of Delhi, Shri Manish Sisodia, has on a couple of occasions, requested the union finance minister as well as a few members of the central cabinet that the government of Delhi, do require some financial assistance. Mind you, we are not recognized as a full state as far as the Finance Commission is concerned, the 14th Finance Commission, and therefore the government of Delhi does not even get the share in central taxes. Every government in this country gets share in central taxes, which runs into several thousand crores. Unfortunately, because Delhi is not recognized as a full state, we do not get any money. We haven't got any money in the last 1.5 decades, and we survive on our own. And with the grace of God, we are a surplus government. We have a surplus budget. But in these, extraordinary times, the revenue of the government has also, fallen short of its monthly expenditure.
Right.
And therefore, a lot of austerity measures as well as, financial restrictions have been imposed by the Honorable Chief Minister when he said that only money of the government of Delhi will be used to pay salaries and nothing else, and no other expenditure will be sanctioned. We have requested the Honorable Finance Minister to give us some financial help. I am sure that they will consider that request of the Chief Minister as well as the Finance Minister of Delhi favorably, and some sort of financial help I think every state needs, the government of Delhi certainly requires.
Yes, indeed. Let's also get an industry perspective in from Ankur Bhatia, Executive Director of the Bird Group, who's with us this morning. Ankur Bhatia, would you have hoped perhaps for more details on what kind of easing of restrictions there was going to be post the 20th of April? The Prime Minister, of course, has made sure, has been very categorical that for the next week at least, this is perhaps the most critical period when there has to be, if anything, an even tighter lockdown.
Well, I think on the outside, I'm quite relieved and happy of the extension right now. While, as you know, that the industry and everybody is suffering economically, but I think human life is of more importance than anything else. And given the circumstance and given the numbers, what we are seeing of the cases going up, I think a lockdown for now is the right thing to do. The Prime Minister also mentioned in his speech that they will come out with a plan after by tomorrow, and in detail that after 20th, if there are any green zones where there have not been any cases, to slowly open. But from an industry point of view, I think first intention definitely will be to curtail that, and to curtail that to a point that it doesn't come back again, because there is no point in sacrificing this time when we are looking into this situation right now of giving up work, and then we have a spike again. So first of all, it is very important to get and eliminate it completely. But I think the good part about India and the states, and I was, from Delhi as well, that our local economies are good and big enough that once we are able to eliminate this from the city of Delhi, and we are able to open up, there would be ample amount of business which can be transacted within Delhi. Our economies are big enough the numbers are big enough as certain small countries in Europe. So I'm not bothered about the comeback. I think that can come back soon. But if there is any fear at all of an outbreak happening again, or if there's any fear, I think that is when it's going to be a problem of the economy turning back.
All right. Medically speaking, we're being joined at this point by Dr. Srinivas, General Secretary of the Resident Doctors Association of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which has been dealing with India's COVID-19 outbreak right from the very beginning. Dr. Srinivas, we heard the Prime Minister say that the next 1 week or so was perhaps going to be critical for India, and therefore it was even more important now than perhaps even before in these earlier 3 weeks to follow restrictions as strictly as possible and enforce them as strictly as possible. Tell us a little more about that, if you will.
It is happy to see the Prime Minister acknowledge the concerns of the people, the healthcare workers and society at large. But it is also important to note that how will common people have access to healthcare facilities because the regular OPDs are shut or they are operating at limited capacity? The important concern would also be to address the issues of non-COVID patients who need healthcare access. And as we know, even on a regular day, people would have difficulty accessing healthcare facilities. So how are we going to address those concerns during this pandemic is yet to be seen. Though the proposals are good, how they reflect in the ground is yet to be seen.
All right. Let's also get a word in from Amitabh Dubey. I think a concern that's been flagged repeatedly, of course, has been the concern about food and how we reach food to those who need it the most right now. We saw those terribly distressing pictures of a man and several dogs sort of trying to get a bit of milk off a street, milk that had been spilt over there. And it really sort of hit home what it's like for so many people in this country who have absolutely no food security at the moment. The fact that there are 77 million tons of stored grain, how do we reach that to the people who need it the most? It's going to be imperative for the government to outline all of those in the days ahead, surely.
Yeah, so, the measures that the government took, whether it's the Jan Dhan transfer payments, PM Kisan and all that, and everyone acknowledged at the time, it's a good first step. The problem with those steps is they have very high exclusion errors because not everyone has a Jan Dhan Yojana account or at least a functional Jan Dhan Yojana account. And the people at the margins are the ones who get left out. And unfortunately, there's a large number of people at the margins. And that's why we see all of these issues. We have food stocks that are 3 to 4 times what we need them to be. So I think what I would like to see, and we've had 3 weeks go by already, but we still have time to take action, is perhaps a mission mode, a national emergency level activity to get this food to the people who are excluded from other means. Some states like Chhattisgarh, for instance, I know has sent food supplies even to people who are not eligible for PDS. So every panchayat has a certain amount of rice for people who may not fall into. So that's one way to deal with exclusion error. What's happened now is that the costs of exclusion have become very severe because of the very intense situation we find ourselves. So I would like to see the government to take very direct and overt and high level of energy actions, whether it is to get food, whether it is, well, there are many other measures, for instance, to help industry. A GST cut would probably help industry immediately as opposed to measures that take time. So there's a whole range of things. So I would personally like to see a high level of energy in addressing some of these very severe problems because the steps taken so far are a good beginning, but don't go far enough.
Right. Let's get some reactions in from the states. Sam Daniel joining us at this point from Chennai, and Tamil Nadu, of course, has seen a spike in cases recently. Sam, what are you hearing? Are we likely to see sort of more steps being outlined at the state level in Tamil Nadu also?
Ankita, we are yet to hear a formal response or reaction from the ruling AIADMK in Tamil Nadu. The Chief Minister had already announced extension of the lockdown yesterday till the 30th of April, and now it's going to be 3 more days of lockdown according to the Prime Minister's order. And the state is in that sense fully prepared. And in terms of relief based on the ground realities or ground situation, at the moment of the 38 districts in Tamil Nadu, 34 have positive cases, and at least 17 of these districts have 20 and above positive cases. And Chennai tops this with 205 cases, Coimbatore 126 and Tirupur 79. So these may not, at the moment, may not receive any kind of relief or any kind of relaxation. But there are at least 7 districts which have positive cases less than 10. And these 7 to 10 districts, many hope, could get some kind of relief later. These include Perambalur, Ariyalur, Kallakurichi, Ramanathapuram and Tenkasi. And the top 3, of course, are Chennai, Coimbatore and Tirupur. Of course, in terms of political reaction, the DMK says they are quite disappointed about the Prime Minister's address because they say the address does not have any solution in terms of relief for large sections of the poor people, migrant laborers, particularly the industry sector which was looking for a kind of an economic stimulus. Also, more importantly, they say the Prime Minister has not talked about enlarging the ambit of testing and also supplying states with adequate number of testing kits. For example, in Tamil Nadu, the consignment expected from China, 1 lakh test kits, have been diverted to America. We don't have. So these are concerns at the moment. But PMK, an ally of the BJP, they welcome the Prime Minister's announcement saying that this will lead to further checking the spread of the virus in the state. This could lead to the state fighting it more effectively, they've said.
All right. Thanks very much indeed for that, Sam. And it's an interesting point you raised there about PPE, about medical exports that India is doing at this point. Dr. Srinivas, I'd like your view on that. There's been so much talk really about the need for PPEs or personal protective equipment for our health workers here in India, or for that matter, debates about India's exports now of hydroxychloroquine, which is being seen as something that is needed for health workers particularly. Would you have liked to have heard more about sort of concerns that have specifically been raised by frontline COVID workers?
Definitely, as everybody has pointed out, the Prime Minister lists a set of concerns, but he doesn't offer clear solutions about how these are going to be dealt with. That is the real concern as a representative of the healthcare community also. When we extend the lockdown, do we have enough PPE when the lockdown is taken away? And do we have enough provisions for all the doctors to reopen OPD by wearing PPE? So PPE is a really important concern, and as we have seen, there is a surge of cases among healthcare workers. Hospitals have been shut down. There are even deaths reported in healthcare workers. So it is important that governments puts up some concrete plans to address the PPE shortage and ensure that healthcare workers are able to work safely.
And what about ramping up medical infrastructure, even as we look at sort of restrictions and the lockdown continuing? At some point, we have to look at a way of living with the virus, as it were. When restrictions are eased, we can't keep a country of 1.3 billion people in lockdown forever.
Definitely, government should look at long-term plans to ramp up infrastructure. The government has been spending very dismally, say like less than 2% of the GDP. So government should ensure that all the expenditure goes into long-term planning rather than looking at short-term options. Government should invest in government sector, and the facilities which are made available now should be available for an extended period for the welfare of the country, so that the country is able to have better health facilities even after the pandemic is over.
All right, I'm going to take quick last comments now. Raghav Chadha, before we wrap this up, what would be perhaps the best case scenario going ahead? Close coordination between the states and the centre. What is it that the Delhi government, for instance, would be hoping for?
Well, yes, first of all, there has been close coordination from day one. I think keeping aside political, ideological differences that one has had with the ruling dispensation, you have seen that from day one, whether it's the Lieutenant Governor, the Delhi Police, the Union Health Minister, the Prime Minister, the government of Delhi has worked in close coordination with all of the above. And I think going forward, working closely with the central government will be something that the government of Delhi will do, because it's a pandemic. I think the whole country needs to come together. All governments need to come together. The people need to come together to fight this. And community transmission is something that the community and community alone can stop. No government or no agency of the state can help us fight community transmission. Number one. Number two, I feel prevention is better than cure. As we say, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, I don't think prevention is better than cure. I feel prevention is perhaps the only cure. And that is the mantra with which the government of Delhi is going forward. We've made adequate arrangements for the food, boarding and lodging of the poor, the downtrodden. We have declared about roughly 43 places as containment zones where COVID-19 patients have been diagnosed. And those entire 43 places have been cordoned off. I hope that going forward, this number will not increase, should not increase, or should not increase by leaps and bounds. That would be prime focus of the government of Delhi. We have also started sanitization in various parts of the city.
Yes,
and
yes, indeed. The Delhi government is to be praised for all of those moves, but I am very short of time, so I'm going to get a quick comment in from Ankur Bhatia as well. Going forward, Ankur Bhatia, what is it that you would hope for clarity on from the government when it comes to at least easing some restrictions when that happens, whether it's after the 20th of April or even sort of further down the line, to just get some production back on track, whether it's sort of small scale, medium enterprises? How long can industry be completely shut down?
See, as I rightly said, as I've sort of said before, that first instance is to save lives. So the first instance is to ensure that there is no spread of this particular virus. For this interim, I would like to also say that the industry should come together to do support the needy right now. Our hotels in Delhi are actually giving food to 1,000 people for lunches and dinners in coordination with the administration and the police on a regular basis. So such efforts throughout the industry is important right now. But how does it come back? I think to come back, I think we need to have an elimination, or at least, which is a longer term thing, at least a cure, an antiviral or a vaccine to it. Now that we don't see coming right now, but we can always use this time to ensure that we are at home. We could all ensure that this thing doesn't spread. We could all ensure that there is social distancing, so that in the next weeks, we are able to at least contain this to an extent that the industry can slowly open up and start getting into production again.
All right. Quick last words, Amitabh Dupe. I do have to wrap this up.
Yeah. So basically, the challenge for the government is to make sure that the after effects of the cure are not as bad as the disease itself. And as Dr. Srinivas said, we have to deal with COVID patients, but we also have to make sure that people with other problems, very severe health problems, don't get shut out.
Yes.
Similarly, we have to shut down the economy, perhaps in a more smart way, but we have to make sure that the economic consequences are not devastating in their own. And for this, I'd like to see much more from the government.
All right. We leave it at that. Thanks very much indeed to all of you for joining us at this point for our special coverage of the Prime Minister's speech. More guidelines expected tomorrow. And then, of course, it really is going to be the onus is going to be on the states and indeed even district level administrations to ensure lockdown stage 2. We'll continue to get you all the latest on that big story. For the moment, it's time for a quick break.